Let's talk about Belgium and all these bonds. I know, as a, you're a banking expert. You're one of your things that you in your feather in your hat is you are a investment banker, and you must be looking at the buying of bonds, treasuries in Belgium, going, huh? Say what? I mean, it's a $480 billion GDP, and I think they're holding now 340 or something billion in U.S. treasuries. They bought 140 billion. Paul Craig Roberts is saying, where'd the money come from in the last few months? Other people like Carl Denninger are saying, well, they're supposed to account for that on the books, and they don't really do it, so it's not really proven out. What do you say about all this? The treasuries owned by Belgium, a tiny country, but, it's the heart of the Euro, or the EU.
Sure. One thing we can be sure of, the buying is not coming from Belgium. It shows up as Belgium on the TIC report. The TIC report is the Treasury report that comes out periodically showing foreign holdings of U.S. government securities. This report actually was created by a friend of mine, Tony Fraudo, when he was at the Treasury a few years ago. This report hasn't been out for a long time. They've been doing it for, I think, 7 or 8 years. I'm sorry, a little bit longer than that, maybe 10 years, but it's a fairly recent innovation. But here's the thing with that. You mentioned my background. For 10 years, I was chief lawyer and chief credit officer of one of the primary dealers, one of the banks that are so-called primary dealers. What's a primary dealer? Well, when the Fed engages in money operations, what they call market operations, they buy or sell U.S. government securities to create money. When the Fed wants to print money, they buy securities and they pay for the securities with money they just printed. When they want to reduce the money supply, they sell securities and they get paid for it, and that money just disappears down a black hole. So these open market operations are how the Fed increases or decreases the money supply. Of course, since 2008, they've been doing nothing but increasing the money supply by, close to $4 trillion. Well, when they buy or sell securities, who do they buy or sell with? In other words, who are the counterparties? Well, the Fed has an approved list. It's a very small list. There are only about 20 names on the list. My former firm was one of those names, and being on that list is what makes you a primary dealer. So the Fed was our customer, in other words. We dealt with them. I met regularly at the Fed, met with top Fed officials. I was down at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York numerous times. So I'm very kind of intimately familiar with how the Fed does this. Now, people say, well, it's not Belgium. Who is it? Well, what's in Belgium? Well, you have Euroclear. Euroclear is a major custodian and clearinghouse for all kinds of securities. So if a third party, someone else, was buying those securities, they could hold them in custody at Euroclear, and that would show up as Belgian ownership, even though the country of Belgium is not the owner. And also, as you point out, Greg, Belgium is the headquarters of the European Union in Brussels. So who could the buyer be? We don't know, and again, I don't want to guess. I don't believe in that kind of speculation. I like to stick to the facts. But we do know the following. In the crisis in 2009, when U.S. banks were on the verge of collapse and European banks were on the verge of collapse, both central banks, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, were busy bailing out their banking system. Well, the U.S. could just print money, but the European Central Bank had a problem, which is a lot of their banks under their jurisdiction, had U.S. dollar liabilities to U.S. money market funds. Now, the problem there is the European Central Bank can print euros, but they can't print dollars. So if you're trying to bail out a bank that needs dollars and you print euros, where are you going to get the dollars? Well, the answer is that the Fed and the ECB engaged in the swap arrangement. The Fed printed dollars, the European Central Bank printed euros, and then they swapped them. So this gave the European Central Bank dollars that they could use to bail out their banks. Now, this was not disclosed at the time. The only reason we know anything about it was because Dodd-Frank, believe it or not, had some provisions requiring a little bit of transparency. These swaps were in the tens of trillions of dollars. Trillions, not billions. They were huge, and they're still in place. So could the Fed and the European Central Bank be engaged in a swap where the European Central Bank gets dollars from the Fed, goes out through Euroclear on an anonymous basis, and buys the U.S. Treasuries? That is possible. I don't know for a fact if that's what happens, if that's what has happened, but it does seem the most likely scenario, because who else?
And that wouldn't show up on the Fed's the books on what they have to report, would it?
Correct. That's correct. That's correct. When people say the Fed's buying them, the Fed might be financing them, but the Fed's not buying them. The European Central Bank could be buying them, but the Fed could be giving the European Central Bank the dollars they need to buy them. And so in effect, indirectly, the Fed's financing the purchase of treasuries, but they have an indirect buyer through the European Central Bank. So that would not show up on the Fed balance sheet. By the way, these swaps I talked about, where the two central banks swap currencies, those are off balance sheet. Those are not publicly reported by the Fed. We don't know how big they are. We know they exist because of Dodd-Frank. We know that the magnitude is in the tens of trillions, possibly more. But we don't know the size because the Fed does not disclose that. The European Central Bank does not disclose it. And so they get off balance sheet dollars. And then if you have Euroclear as a nominal buyer, we don't even know, or custodian, let's say, that shows up as Belgium on a tick report, and we don't even know who the real buyer is. So this is, by the way, the same thing goes on with the Bank for International Settlements when it comes to gold. As I say, we can dig out a footnote in the BIS financial statements, but we don't know who's actually doing it. So Bank for International Settlements, Euroclear, European Central Bank, these are all backdoor channels the Fed can use to manipulate the dollar and manipulate gold, and they are doing it. The evidence is clear.
And the reason why that these bonds are showing up in Belgium through Euroclear, that is probably the buyer. They're doing it because nobody's buying the treasuries. People are dumping the treasuries. I mean, they're doing it because
that's correct. That's correct. Remember,
are they desperate? I mean, it sounds crazy to me.
It's not crazy. When your system's collapsing, you get desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. Now, here's the thing. Euroclear is not the buyer. They're the custodian. But that's so it shows up as Belgium on the report. We're speculating that Euroclear is the custodian because that's the only entity there. This is not coming from Belgian banks. It's not coming from Belgian dentists.
There's no exposure to Belgium.
Tick report lists the buyer by country, which is really just the source. It's where the source of the money is coming from, but it does not identify the buyer by name. We can be certain it's not Belgium because they don't have that much money. The economy's not that big, and it's not anyone in Belgium for the same reason. So it's a third party. We can be pretty sure it's not China and not Russia, not Saudi Arabia for other reasons. And so it is likely the European Central Bank, and they would get the dollars from the Fed under these swap arrangements as we just discussed. Now here's the thing. Why is this going on? Because others are dumping. We know that Russia has dumped hundreds of billions of dollars of treasury securities. China can't dump most of what they have, but at the margin, they're not buying any more. Because they want to buy other assets, gold, particularly, but they're investing a lot in Europe and buying mining, natural resource assets around the world. By the way, there's another buyer out there if the Fed gets desperate. See, here's the problem, Greg. There is a huge struggle going on right now inside the Fed. Maybe that's a subject for another interview because that's a fairly long discussion between the hawks and the doves. The doves believe that there's really no limit to the Fed balance sheet. They're at $4 trillion. They could go to $8 trillion. They could go to $12 trillion, whatever it takes. They could just keep printing money. The hawks have a different view. They say a couple things. Number one, there may not be a legal limit, which there isn't, but there's a confidence limit. At some point, you could collapse confidence in the dollar. The Fed is close to that limit and therefore probably needs to, taper the QE and maybe even reduce the assets on the balance sheet at this point. So that's what's going on. There's a struggle. Right now, we have a very hawkish FOMC for a couple of reasons. The FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, they're the ones who determine these policies. Now, it's supposed to be 7 members of the governors of the Federal Reserve Board and 4 regional reserve bank presidents. So a total of 11 members, 7 and 4. Right now, there are 3 vacancies on the Federal Reserve Board. So they only have 4 out of the 7 votes. So when they show up for a meeting, it's not 11 people, it's 8 people, 4 governors and 4 reserve bank presidents. Historically, the Reserve Bank presidents have been much more hawkish than the governors. So instead of coming in 7-4, you come in 4-4. You're outnumbered by the hawks. And among the presidents, we have 2 of the most hawkish members of all right now, Charles Plosser of Philadelphia and Richard Fisher of Dallas. So this is an extremely hawkish board. And remember, Yellen is new on the job. She may be chairwoman, but she's not a dictator. She needs to build consensus. When you're the new kid on the block, you don't walk into a board meeting and blow up policy. It takes months or even a year or more to form that consensus. So right now you have a hawkish board that wants to back away. So the Fed is looking around the world for other, I call them buyers of last resort. Right now they seem to be coming from Europe, probably the European Central Bank. But don't forget the U.S. banking system itself. In the 1950s, a typical bank balance sheet, well, just the consolidated bank balance sheet of all the banks in the United States, had more than 50% of their assets in Treasury securities. Today, that number is less than 10%. So there's a lot of headroom between 10% and 50%. In other words, they can force the banks to buy the bonds. In 2008, the banks were bailed out.
This can go on for a while.
It can go on for a while, but we'll start to see it in different ways. We'll see, when these tick reports come out, we'll see Russia dumping. We'll see maybe Saudi Arabia and others dumping. We'll see, Belgium buying. Now, you won't see, if they force the banks to buy, which they can do, you won't see that on the tick report because those are only foreign buyers. It will show up in FDIC and OCC, Office of the Control of the Currency. It will show up in other reports. I mean, this is not easy forensically. You got to look in a lot of places. You have to know how the system works. You have to really dig. But that's what I like to do. I like to stick to hard evidence and not engage in some of the, more wild speculation you read on some of these websites, et cetera. But, in 2008, the banker said, gee, this is great. We were bailed out. We get to keep our jobs. We get to keep our bonuses. We get to keep ripping off savers and ripping off the economy. This is a really good deal for us, pay ourselves big bonuses, et cetera. But what they're gradually discovering is that there was a price to pay. It's really a deal with the devil. The price to pay is that the banks are now captive by the government. The government can shut down or break up any one of them whenever they want. And using that as a threat behind the scenes, they can force the banks to buy the bonds. So if the Fed balance sheet gets tapped out, which it is, and now we have this European mystery buyer, which maybe there's a limit on that, they can always turn to the banks. So this can go on for a long time. But the problem is, at what point do investors, citizens, countries around the world just say, you know what, this is obviously such a game. There's obviously no way out. You sort of have the Fed has two choices, and they're both bad. If they continue the taper, which they may, they're tapering into weakness, they're going to throw the U.S. into a recession within the depression. We've been in a depression since 2007, but you can have a little bit of growth in a depression. It just means that depression just means your growth is below trend. But you can have multiple recessions in a depression, which is what we had in the Great Depression from 1929 to 1940. There were two technical recessions, 1929 to 1933 and 1937. So this could be the second recession within a depression if the Fed continues to taper. If they don't continue the taper, they pause, which is a possibility, and they increase asset purchases, maybe in 2015, people call it QE4 or whatever, then this will be a signal to the market that the Fed has got to keep printing. And then gold's going to go up and the dollar's going to collapse because it'll be very obvious that there's no way for this game to end. So the Fed has kind of two choices: depression, hyperinflation. Good luck with that. But that's what happens when you manipulate markets. You paint yourself into a corner and there's no way out.
Shouldn't they have just said in 2008, we're going to print $6 trillion. We're going to cover all the depositors, and your bondholders, you're done. Your shareholders, sorry. We're going to save the system in terms of the depositors, and everybody's going to have to take a hit here and now. Wouldn't that have been better? Wouldn't that have been cheaper?
Absolutely better, absolutely cheaper. And by the way, you wouldn't have had to print $6 trillion or whatever the number was. You could have issued guarantees. In other words, what they should have done is just nationalized all the banks. They were all failing. They were failing sequentially. What the Fed did, they truncated the sequential failure. They said, okay, we're going to draw a line. So, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman, AIG, you guys fail, but Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Citi, we're going to preserve you guys. If they hadn't done that, they all would have collapsed. Goldman Sachs would have collapsed. They were bailed out. Morgan Stanley would have collapsed. They were bailed out, et cetera. So that's what the Fed did. They should have let them all fail. When I say fail, wipe out the stockholders, haircut the bondholders, but you could have guaranteed the deposits, prevented a run off the bank without printing a nickel. You don't have to print a nickel. All you have to do is expand federal deposit insurance. They could have done that, strip out the bad assets, put them in, and then IPO the clean banks, because you don't want the governments running the banks forever. You just would have had a temporary nationalization, very similar to what the government did with General Motors. That got IPO'd not long after. They could have re-IPO'd the banks, except they would have been clean banks that could have made loans to get the economy moving, and the pain on the stockholders and the bondholders would have been, you guys put money into these banks. You deserve to lose. The taxpayers and the citizens do not deserve to lose. They do not deserve to have their savings stolen through inflation. Instead, let's put the loss where it belongs, on the institutional investors and the bondholders. But the Treasury didn't want to do that, and the Fed didn't want to do that because of the cronyism. Those large institutions are their friends. These guys are all buddies. I've seen it in action. When LTCM was bailed out, long-term capital management was bailed out, one of our partners was the former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. You don't think that kind of cronyism is always a play. But the problem is you make it worse, you make it worse. So the next collapse will be bigger than the Fed. That's the difference. When I talk about this coming collapse, people say, well, we've had these panics before, we've had these drawdowns before, and we always muddle through. Well, the answer is, yeah, we have muddled through. We muddle through in ways that make the problem worse. The next problem will be bigger than the Fed, and then so the IMF is actually going to have to bail out the United States.
James Rickards, there's the book, Another back-to-back bestseller for James Rickards. It is The Death of Money. You talk all about the coming collapse of the international monetary system. James Rickards, thank you for coming on USA Watchdog and enlightening us about the events that you have forecasted and described in your book. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg.